Hello and thank you for watching. So in this slideshow, I will present some of the findings concerning the neuroscience of meditation. And I have to say that it's an extremely complex area and I can only present some of the basic findings. So I hope it may provoke your interest and inspire you to look further into this area. My name is Christian. I'm the Center Director of the Center for Mental Health Promotion at University of Copenhagen. Please look into our website for more information on our work. We can start out by this review from 2016 by Kieran Fox and colleagues, which is, as the title says, about the functional neuroanatomy of meditation across 78 studies. So functional neuroanatomy, that means that these studies have measured the blood flow through the brain during different tasks and situations. And basically, across 78 studies, Kieran Fox and colleagues are trying to summarize the most important regions for different types of meditation. So from this review, we see the following figure. So as you can see, they have divided different types of studies into 4 types of meditation. So focused attention is the type of meditation where you focus on something rather specific, for example, the breath or a mantra, a holy word. Open monitoring meditations are slightly less structured. You may follow a process of your emotions or thoughts. Mantra recitation is a specific type of meditation using a word as a focus. And loving kindness or compassion meditation are sometimes also called emotion-producing meditations, where you try to establish and nourish feelings of loving kindness or compassion, for example. So naturally, the most central regions depend on the type of meditation that you're doing. So as you see, focused attention meditations are activating the red dots in these figures. So that would be the anterior cingulate, the dorsal anterior cingulate, for example, in the middle figure on the top line of brain images. And also you can see on the bottom the insula, the red dot in the bottom left. And so these regions I will come back to in a second, but this was just to show you a brief overview before we begin the more detailed discussion. So as you can see, a lot of dots are actually in the middle of the brain, again the top row of images. So the midline of the brain is relevant. And as you can see, several dots are also in the bottom 2 images in the insula, which is related to bodily sensations, more specifically the internal bodily sensations, the sense of the body on the inside, so to speak. So we will speak a little bit more in details about these images to begin with, but just please notice that the prefrontal cortex, or the front part and external part of the brain, is central for several types of meditation. The midline, or the middle part of the brain, which is actually also the surface of the brain, it's the cortex that's folded down here, is central. And also the insula is central across several types of meditation. So these three areas are theoretically important areas for meditation. The anterior cingulate, or the middle prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, is related to attention, self-monitoring or process monitoring, introspection and regulation of attention, ranking of processes and other functions. And I have put in a reference here on a review of the anterior cingulate functions. And the insula is related to bodily awareness, an internal sense of the body, what you call interoception, and also of regulation through the internal sense of the body, sense of self, empathy, and decision-making, as we shall see. So all these areas are extremely complex and related to many functions, but this is just to mention some of the important ones. And finally, the orbitofrontal cortex, or the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is the frontal bottom pole of the brain, which is related to emotion regulation, inhibition of automated processes, also related to the processing of reward, as the Danish professor Morten Kringelbach has shown, and related to sensory integration and executive regulation of processes. So these three areas are central to meditation, theoretically, because meditation is centrally about controlling attentional processes, sensing the body, and top-down or executive regulation of processes. So let's go into the more specific studies. So here is an early study from Britta Hölzel, which measured the frontal midline activation during a baseline state, so just laying in the scanner and doing nothing specifically, but just noticing how it is lying in a functional neuroimaging scanner. So what this study showed, interestingly, was that the anterior cingulate showed increased blood flow activation in MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, participants compared with an inactive control group after 8 weeks of mindfulness training. So this fits perfectly with our theory that the anterior cingulate should be activated during meditation, because this showed a significantly higher increase in blood flow during this period of mindfulness training in the MBSR participants compared to the control participants. So in other words, this simply supports that attentional functions were improved by this intervention, this mindfulness program. Of course, you can also be critical about a study like this. So are we actually measuring meditation effects here? Or are these effects due to the many factors that are involved in an MBSR program? Or are they actually due to the motivation that the MBSR participants may have during this situation? Maybe they're trying harder, maybe they know that they're being measured, and so they're putting an effort into paying attention here. But there are always critical points to single studies. Now this study is a different type of study that I wanted to show you, because this is actually not a study of a meditation program. This is a cross-sectional study by Creswell and colleagues, which is focusing on the correlation between a mindfulness score as completed on a questionnaire by the participants, and then the task of identifying emotions in faces. So here we see again that the middle prefrontal cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the activations in these areas are related to mindfulness as experienced by the participants in their everyday lives. So this is another type of study, because in this study no one has been meditating for 2 months, but we're looking at the ecological validity or the external validity of these regions as correlates of mindfulness. And in this study we find support that the medial front, the medial frontal midline and the ventromedial area is related to participants' experiences of mindfulness during their everyday lives. This of course supports that these areas are relevant for mindfulness and meditative training. This slide shows the main finding from the largest structural study of meditators compared with controls. So in this study, 46 experienced meditators are being compared with 46 matched controls. So this is a very large study to do with 92 participants. And in this study, the investigators are, in this image here, looking at the total neocortex of the human brain, the surface, the most complex area of the human brain, and investigating whether there are structural differences. So that means the way the brain has been building up during the past years. And in this study, the meditators have been meditating for 3 to 4 years on average. And you can see the lower part of the frontal midline is yellow and orange, meaning that there are significantly higher density of neuronal tissue in this area in the meditators compared to the controls. So this may be due to more gray cells, more neurons in this area, or due to more fiber tracts or supporting tissue. But the point is just to say that this structural study also supports that the lower part of the frontal midline is being used more often in experienced meditators. However, again, you can be critical and say that this study is a cross-sectional study, so actually these frontal midline differences may have been here to begin with. Maybe the 46 people who liked meditation the most were the ones who were born with a very strong frontal midline. But again, you just have to look to different types of methods to get different types of results. And then you look across the studies to detect whether there are consistency in the findings. And so, of course, this structural study supports the findings that we looked at in the functional studies of blood flow. So an interesting study, again supporting that the lower part of the frontal midline is strengthened by meditation. In this study, we're looking at a different type of meditation program, the Interactive Mind-Body Training Program from China. And this is a 6-week program. We're looking at the diameter and the isolation of axons. And we can see improvement in these axons and the diameter after just 4 to 6 weeks of training. Interestingly, we also see that the improvement in the myelin sheets, that's the isolation of the fiber tracts in the brain, correlates with the degree of improvement on a symptom scale. So the more strong effect you have in the brain, the more symptom improvement you find. This, of course, again supports that the area we are talking about, the midline in the frontal part of the brain, is important for the changes that we observe in the clinical part as well. So here you see the fibers. Another study of fibers looked at 27 meditators and 27 matched controls, and a wide range of meditation experience in the meditators. So they were looking at fiber tracts in the brain to find out which bundles of fibers were mostly affected or seemed to be affected by meditation. And they concluded that these two fiber tracts were the most different between the two groups, so the anterior thalamic radiation and the cingulate cortex cingulum. And as you can see, these are fiber bundles in the middle and the frontal parts of the brain. So again, we just find evidence that the frontal and the middle frontal part of the brain is being used in different types of meditation. Another study here of Zen meditation, where you can see that basically the same areas as the other studies are being highlighted in this image. So in this study, the finding shows which areas are related to a self-reported mindfulness score and the activity during this Zen meditation process. And again, it's the frontal midline, anterior cingulate, and the lower part of the frontal midline, which is correlated with the mindfulness attention awareness scale, as it's called, the MAS score. And you can see this correlation also between the MAS score and the meditative experience. Again, no single study can show definite answers, but when we look across studies in this way and across different types of meditation, it's very interesting to observe this activation and these correlations with external measures concerning the anterior cingulate and the lower part of the frontal midline, orbitofrontal, ventral, medial, prefrontal areas. We can also look at the frontal lobe more broadly. So there's been several studies looking at activations in the frontal areas, the prefrontal cortex, in different ways. Sarah Lazar and colleagues from Harvard University published a study in 2005 from which this image has been produced. And they found, interestingly, that in a group of meditators, different types of meditation, which had 6 to 8 years of meditation experience, they found no age-related decline of the prefrontal cortex thickness. Now, as we grow older, the prefrontal cortex will become slightly thinner, and this is related to cognitive declines. So it's not always problematic, but as we grow older, the frontal part of the brain wears a little bit out, and the functions that it's supporting, the executive and regulative functions especially, are decreasing slightly. So it was an interesting finding in 2005 that among this mixed group of meditators, they could see no age-related decline of the prefrontal cortex thickness. This was replicated a couple of years later by an Italian study, if I remember correctly, Pagnoni and Cekic, and it was replicated again in 2 later studies. You will also see another image of the study by Luders and colleagues from 2015. So this just shows that the prefrontal cortex in general may be used in meditation, and this has been shown for many decades actually. There's a systematic review in 2014 of effects of mindfulness-based interventions in elderly samples, only 12 studies, but this supported that mindfulness-based programs in general had good effects in elderly samples as well. So this is interesting, of course, because the frontal part of the brain is very important for many functions for us. Now, there are fewer age-related declines in meditating subjects in general. So this is the Luders studies from 2015, and I think this is the largest study of correlations between gray matter and age in the meditation field. So interestingly, here you can see the controls represented by the turquoise circles, and the meditators represented by the yellow pluses. And you can see that there are a lot of subjects in this study, and that the yellow line is slightly less steep than the turquoise line. This shows that there is a generally slightly less decline in gray matter as we grow older in the meditators as compared with the controls. So this is the global gray matter in the whole brain. When we look more specifically at these findings, we see that the differences between these 2 groups are especially in certain parts of the brain. Again, if you look at the frontal midline, you will see a significant cluster here, and there are also other areas that are interesting, including areas in the visual cortex, the insula, and other parts. Now, to summarize, we have looked at some of the studies that are indicating that the frontal part of the brain is relevant in meditation, and more specifically the anterior cingulate and the lower frontal midline, which is related to sensory integration and inhibition of automated processes, for example. And I've just listed some of the studies here that I find interesting. In the bottom line, there are some studies here of long meditation retreats, which also supports that the frontal part and perhaps the frontal midline is especially relevant even for experienced meditators when they go into intensive meditation retreats. Now, in the top line, in the left corner, I've also referenced a study by Kahn and Pollack in Psychological Bulletin. This is a major review of 40 years of EEG studies of frontal effects with attentional implications of meditation studies. So that's an excellent review of some of the early studies of the neuroscience of meditation. I also wanted to mention a little bit about the body. This is an image from the excellent exhibition called Bodies that I strongly recommend. And just again, insula is one of the most relevant areas when we think about sensing the body on the internal side, which is a big part of meditation. So some of the studies of insula here, Justin Brewer and colleagues showed that meditators have a generally higher activation of insula, or the internal sense of the body, or sensing the body on the inside, so to speak. So this is just an image from the baseline comparison, and you can see that meditators show higher activation of insula in both hemispheres, in both sides of the brain. And this is 12 participants compared to 13 matched controls. This has been supported. A third study of insula effects here. We have an intervention where the experimenters are actually delivering small electric shocks, pain stimuli to the participants. This is one of the fun things that you can get to do when you're a neuroscientist. And they are doing this with 17 meditators with 2 to 25 years of experience and 17 matched controls. So this is again a cross-sectional design where we are not studying effects across an intervention, but simply studying differences between two groups. In this study, the experimenters asked the participants to downregulate their sense of pain. So when you receive a small electric shock, try to downregulate your pain. The interesting finding was that the meditators tried to downregulate their pain by increasing their sense of the body. So you might have imagined that people who have meditated would downregulate the pain by avoiding sensing the body, for example, by focusing on a word or an image or something else. But it seems that the meditators tried to downregulate the pain by increasing their sensations in the body. Now, this fits actually very well with the theories in the meditation literature, where you talk about, for example, approach-oriented coping. You talk about openness and in general, an idea of a rather paradoxical idea of approaching what is difficult, because when you're close to things, it's easier to deal with them, you can say. So this definitely showed that the meditators tried to downregulate bodily pain by increasing their bodily sensations. And this was an interesting finding. Insula again. A fourth study here on insula. In this study, they tried to find areas of the brain, regions of the brain, that would correlate with years of experience with meditative practices. And the only area or region that was correlated with meditation experience was the right insula. So actually, the right insula is more often significantly related to meditative activities than the left insula, and there are some tendencies for right lateralization of attention networks during meditative training. And also, for example, in depression treatments involving meditation, there are some studies showing that right lateralizations are related to stronger effects of these meditative programs. So again, the insula here seems to be significantly related to the degree of meditation that you have been performing across the years. Now I would like to show this fun study. It's a Danish study. I'm from Denmark, but it's also a fun study. So in this study, Ulrik Kirk and colleagues from the University of Southern Denmark studied something called the ultimatum game. And they write here the title: the interoception, the sense of the body on the inside, drives increased rational decision making in this ultimatum game. Now the ultimatum game is a famous game, and it's about sharing money. So two people play together and they're offered, for example, $100, and they have to find a way to share them. If they can agree on this, then they receive the money. If they cannot agree, then they do not receive the money. And the problem in the ultimatum game is that people start giving each other provocative proposals. So I will get $10, you will get $90, or the other way around, and then the collaboration collapses. Now the interesting finding in this study was that meditators and non-meditators used different strategies for solving the ultimatum game. So as you can see on the right and the blue bars in the top right corner here, the meditators had much higher activity in the insula when they rejected a collaboration, meaning that they seemed to use bodily sensations to determine whether they should accept or reject a proposal. This is very interesting because, as you see on the blue bars, the control group did not use bodily sensations to determine whether they should reject or accept a proposal. At the same time, you can also see a correlation in the bottom right part of this slide that the perceived mindfulness scores in everyday life was actually correlated with the insular activity when you reject a collaboration. So this is slightly complex, but let me explain again. So the leading researcher, Ulrich Kirch, concluded, or the group of researchers concluded this here. To summarize, we have identified a population of human beings with an unusual tendency to behave more like rational economic agents in the ultimatum game. So this is to say actually that the meditators made more money than the non-meditators in this game because they behaved more rationally. And it seemed that the way they behaved more rationally in this particular game was through increased bodily sensations. And the researchers write, specifically, these experienced meditators are roughly twice as likely as controls to say yes to a free dollar over no money at all. And this is because when you look at how the meditators actually made more money in this game, it was because that they seemed to be better at accepting proposals without sustaining disrupted collaborations. So sometimes in the ultimatum game, what happens is that when a collaboration is rejected, then revenge takes place. So the next many trials can be rejected because participants have disagreed on one trial. And it seemed here that the meditators were better at accepting a free dollar, you can say, at returning to collaborations. But the most important thing for me here was that the insula seemed to be involved in the way the meditators made their decisions to reject collaborations, so more bodily based decisions in this study. There are many studies of meditation and insula. I have just mentioned a few here. The study by Farb and colleagues from 2010 in Emotion is also interesting, showing that meditators used bodily sensations to downregulate reactions to negative stories. And the studies by Micah Allen in the bottom row from 2012 was also interesting, showing involvement of insula in loving kindness meditation. So there are many studies of meditation and insula, and I would strongly recommend to look more into the importance of sensing the body during meditative practices. So this was just a small window looking into the neuroscience of meditation. Of course, there are many things that we do not know, and this is just a very interesting area that I am following with much interest and gratitude to the neuroscientists around the world. Thank you for watching, and give me any comments you like below here. I'll try to answer them. Bye. Other studies, for example, this latest study by Norman Farb, where you compare 16 MBSR participants, again this is mindfulness-based stress reduction, to 15 matched and inactive controls. Inactive just means that they did not receive any intervention, and you compare the changes across a 2-month period of mindfulness training. So the tasks were both internal tasks, focused of attention, So an internal focus means that they focus on the body, an external focus in attention tasks, focusing on, for example, a computer screen. And the results were that we saw higher insular activity with the internal focus. This is unsurprising. This is only logical because a large part of MBSR is scanning the body through a bodily meditation called the body scan. So we expect that the insula should be activated during this type of meditation, and so it's logical that we see this change. Now the next finding is that we have higher activity in the posterior, or the most behind part of the insula in MBSR participants, also when we have an external focus. And the posterior part of the insula is the most sensory part, while the anterior or the frontal part of insula is more regulatory. So this is just interesting that the bodily seems to be more present in general, also with an external focus for the MBSR participants.